But I don't know. We have to find a way to put this country back together. I mean, Abraham Lincoln said it. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Of course, he's canceled now. See, that's what I mean. I mean, Lincoln was they took down the statues in some places, took his name off high schools, including in Illinois. Land of Lincoln. Land of Lincoln canceled Lincoln. Okay, this is my message to liberals. Attention, Whole Food shoppers. When what you're doing sounds like a headline in The Onion, stop doing that, okay? Stop doing that. And this bullshit about always revisiting the past and historical people who don't share your current woke mentality. What a cheap way to look enlightened and big yourself up. Fuck you, Abraham Lincoln.
Good morning. It's Monday, Medal of Honor Monday, January the 29th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have no free lunch, the patriotic shorts, motivational shorts, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, the 33 Strategies of War, and the Medal of Honor. All that and more when I get back. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. Now there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
The enrichment wasn't achieved by government coercion, which is usually counterproductive, nor was it achieved by science unassisted, or the exploitation of slaves, or the routine accumulation of capital, or a profound dialectic of history. It was achieved by liberty alone, a necessary and pretty much sufficient cause. Give people liberty, and by uncoerced cooperation through commerce, they become adults, enriched in body and soul. Deirdre McCloskey. What McCloskey has said here provides us valuable reinforcement. Liberty facilitated greater human action, and out of greater human action came enrichment. A freer mankind, acting with capacity, agency, and incentive, raised the standard of living exponentially upon absorption of this greater freedom. But McCloskey says that liberty was pretty much sufficient, an inadequate but telling qualifier. Yes, liberty enabled free exchange, and in such cooperative effort, adulthood is needed. But it is that coupling of freedom to virtue, to responsibility, to cooperation, to integrity, to morality, to trust, that became the potent formula. Liberty incentivizes it. Liberty is a necessary condition for it. But liberty alone is not sufficient. Liberty coupled with virtue becomes the ideal recipe for prosperity.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now the Patriotic Shorts.
She was in the first class of 39 flight nurses to graduate from the Army Air Force School of Air Evacuations in February 1943. They were taught crash procedures, survival training, and the challenges of nursing at 10,000 feet while under enemy fire. She was First Lieutenant Mary Louise Hawkins, and like all of the nurses in the program, she volunteered for the hazardous assignment. In September 1944, while evacuating wounded soldiers from Peleliu, their C-47 crashed on Bellona Island. One of the soldiers suffered a severed trachea and was bleeding profusely. With only seconds to spare, she rigged the inflation tube from her life preserver to clear his throat and provide him oxygen for a staggering 19 hours. The flight began with 24 boys in my care, and I was determined it would end with 24 boys in my care, she recalled through tears shortly before passing in 2007. Lieutenant Hawkins became the first woman awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross during World War II. He was working in the coal mines of West Virginia when he enlisted in the Army. As a member of the 101st Airborne, he was part of the First Night's Drop during the D-Day invasion. He was Sergeant Harrison Summers, and as dusk turned to evening on June 6, 1944, he was ordered to take out an entire German company in a makeshift farmhouse barracks with just 15 men. It was considered a suicide mission, so only 2 men followed as he assaulted the German barracks. Over the course of 5 grueling hours, Summers killed 30 German soldiers and captured dozens more, almost single-handedly completing the mission. Summers would go on to fight as part of Operation Market Garden in Holland, as well as in Bastogne, receiving 2 more Purple Hearts along the way. He was twice put forward for a Medal of Honor, but it was denied. When asked why he took on a German company almost single-handedly, he simply responded, "Someone had to do it. Might as well be me."
When Captain Andrews felt his F-16 shake from the impact of an Iraqi surface-to-air missile, he had fractions of a second to grab the ejection handle and punch out if he wanted to avoid going down with the flaming jet. But as the missile exploded, the negative G-forces pressed him against the canopy. He managed to pull the handle, but now he was falling through the sky towards the Iraqi desert, deep in enemy territory. He was clearly in grave danger, but his main concern was not himself, but rather his fellow pilots who were still flying overhead, well within range of the Iraqi missiles. And so while still falling toward the earth, he pulled out his radio and started giving them information about the enemy. Then he hit the ground. The force of impact broke his leg, yet despite the pain, he continued telling the pilots whenever a missile was launched, when to turn, and when to employ flares. Finally, Iraqi soldiers surrounded him at gunpoint, and he was forced to surrender. A few days later, the war ended, and he was awarded the Air Force Cross for his act of heroism.
Robert Weil and Jim Levy were best friends growing up in rural Alabama. They had spent hot summers together playing ball, chasing girls, and getting in and out of mischief. Both enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, ready to give their all to their country. Weil remained stateside for much of the war while Levy was sent overseas. On D-Day, Captain Jim Levy was part of the Chemical Mortar Battalion that landed on Omaha Beach. Levy would survive the war but never discussed it with his best friend Robert Weil. 50 years later, Weil visited the cemetery at Omaha Beach. He ran into an elderly gentleman and they struck up a conversation. "I was here," the stranger told Weil, "part of the Chemical Mortar Battalion." "Wow," Weil responded. "So was my best friend, Jimmy Levy." The stranger was overcome with emotions. "Captain Levy was my company commander. I was one of his platoon leaders. He saved our platoon."
No pilot in their right mind would leave a jet while flying at 2,400 miles per hour. But in 1966, an SR-71 test pilot had no choice. In fact, he didn't so much leave the plane as the plane left him. You see, while soaring at 78,000 feet, the engine failed, causing the plane to pitch violently upward. He tried to regain control by pushing the control stick as far forward and to the left as it would go, but nothing happened. That's when the pilot blacked out, and the SR-71 began to break apart from the forces of Mach 3 flight. When he came to, he thought he was dead, until he realized he was free-falling through the sub-freezing upper atmosphere. He felt his parachute deploy automatically, but couldn't see anything, so he had no idea how high he was. When he finally pried open his faceplate using his frozen fingers, he saw a barren, snowy desert below him, where he soon made a landing. Then he contacted the test office, where the team learned for the first time that against all odds, he had survived.
3 U.S. soldiers were killed today, and at least 34 were injured after a drone attack struck a base in Jordan, with the number of injured expected to rise as 8 are in critical condition and have been medically evacuated. The attack was carried out by Iranian-sponsored militant groups, and the Islamic resistance in Iraq claimed responsibility for the attack. And this is the first time U.S. soldiers have been killed by Iranian proxies since they started. It's an incredible escalation that will likely be met with a massive response. This is the bloodiest attack on U.S. troops in the Middle East in a while, and it's also the first lethal drone strike on the U.S. ever. U.S. senators are already calling on the president to strike Iran, with Senator Lindsey Graham saying, "Hit Iran now, hit them hard." The Speaker of the House saying that America must send a crystal clear message. Also, a member of the House Armed Services Committee said that Iran is directly ordering these attacks. And the president says that a response is coming, with response plans reportedly being drawn up at this very moment, and it could come as early as tonight. It also wouldn't be surprising if Iran itself gets it in addition to these groups in Iraq and Syria, with this reportedly being the 159th Iranian-sponsored attack on the U.S. since October. But as all of this develops, follow to stay in the loop. The U.S. is currently debating several significant attack options on Iran, with these ranging from attacking targets in Iran and denying it was them, or even drone striking Iranian officials, to then more cautious actions like striking Iranian forces outside of Iran or just attacking their proxy groups. And this is the White House says we don't want a wider war in the region, but we have to do what we have to do. And this is in addition to the 3 deaths. The amount of wounded soldiers has now risen to over 40. Now, Iran has spent the morning proclaiming their innocence, saying they had nothing to do with the attack and that their resistance groups make their own decisions. But the U.S. believes that Iran has far more control of them and is far more involved than they say they are. So now Iranian air defenses have reportedly been raised to a state of maximum readiness as they prepare for a potential response. Also, just days before this, China told Iran to cut the shit, and earlier this month, the U.S. warned Iran of an imminent terror attack that would later go on to kill several Iranians because they ignored it. And ultimately, President Biden now faces a delicate situation. Can you hit Iran and its allies hard enough to deter them from future attacks, but not hit them so hard that it starts another war? Follow to stay in the loop.
Alan McGee was a ball turret gunner on a B-17 bomber, making a daylight bombing run over Saint-Nazaire, France, when one of the most miraculous events of World War II occurred. The bomber was en route to the target when McGee's ball turret was damaged by German flak. It was then that he noticed that his chest parachute had been torn and rendered useless. McGee became dizzy from a lack of oxygen at the high altitude and was thrown clear of the aircraft at 22,000 feet. After a 4-mile plummet, he crashed through the glass roof of the Saint-Nazaire railroad station. German soldiers found him dangling from the steel girders. He was severely wounded, but amazingly still alive. McGee's right leg and ankle were broken. He had 28 wounds from shrapnel and glass, and his right arm was cut nearly the whole way off. A German doctor was able to save his arm, and McGee eventually made a full recovery. He spent most of the rest of the war as a POW. Alan Eugene McGee passed away weeks shy of his 85th birthday in 2003.
And that was the military patriotic shorts. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the motivational shorts.
Here, we'll do a little bit of arithmetic. So, a while back, Disney executive mentioned on video, she said, well, I have 2 children, 5 and 7. One is trans and the other is pansexual. And I just thought mathematically right away, it's like the chance you have a trans kid is 1 in 3,000. That's not a very high chance. And let's say the chance that you have a pansexual kid is the same, whatever pansexual means. But whatever that is rarer than trans, because no one ever even heard about it until 5 years ago. So the joint probability that you have a trans kid and a pansexual kid is 1 in 9 million. The odds that you're a pathological narcissist sacrificing your own children to the glorification of your compassion is 8,999,999 to 1. So, do you have a trans kid and a pansexual kid, or are you a devouring mother? Well, you can look at the odds and decide for yourself.
Traffic, in 333 Lima Delta. Come in. Airman 333 Lima Delta, Fort Pierce Tower. I've got a serious situation here. My pilot has gone incoherent. I have no idea how to fly the airplane, but I'm maintaining at 9100. Number 333 Lima Delta, Roger. What's your position? I have no idea. I can see the coast of Florida in front of me, and I have no idea. American 1845. You can make the left turn there, hold short of 10 left. It's going to be a couple minutes. You just witnessed a couple passengers land that plane. Not a problem. Go ahead and continue. We'll hold short 10 left, American 1845. Man, they did a great job. Did you say the passengers landed the airplane? That's correct. Oh my gosh, no, great job. No flying experience. We got a controller that worked them down. That's a flight instructor.
I've never, in all my years as a clinical psychologist, and this is something that really does terrify me, I have never seen anyone ever get away with anything at all, even once. There's that old idea that God has a book, and keeps track of everything in heaven. It's like, okay, maybe it's not a book, fine. But that is a really useful thing to think about because, well, and maybe you disagree. Maybe you think people get away with things all the time. I tell you, I've never seen it. What I see instead is the thing happens, right? Someone twists the fabric of reality, and they do it successfully because it doesn't snap back at them that moment. And then like 2 years later, something unravels, and they get walloped, and they think, oh my God, that's so unfair. And then we track it. It's like, well, what happened before that? This. Well, then what? This. And then what? This. And then what? Oh, this. Well, that's where it went wrong. It's because you can't twist the fabric of reality without having it snap back. It doesn't work that way, and why would it? Because what are you going to do? Twist the fabric of reality? I don't think so.
And that was the motivational shorts. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the daily laws for January the 29th.
January 29th. Become who you are. Some 2,600 years ago, the ancient Greek poet Pindar wrote, "Become who you are by learning who you are." What he meant is the following. You are born with a particular makeup and tendencies that mark you as a piece of fate. It is who you are to the core. Some people never become who they are. They stop trusting in themselves, they conform to the tastes of others, and they end up wearing a mask that hides their true nature. Daily law. If you allow yourself to learn who you really are by paying attention to that voice and force within you, then you can become what you were fated to become. An individual. A master. Mastery, Chapter 1. Discover your calling. The life's task.
And that was the Daily Law for January the 29th from The Daily Laws by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
The more you walk the path of Christ, the more you will be opposed. You know that, don't you? And people say, what do you mean I'm going to be opposed? Well, just wait. You'll find out. If you're consistently on the path of Christ, trust me, they will come out after you. You know that line from Churchill I've quoted many times? Never trust a man who has no enemies. That means he stands for nothing. Dead right, it seems to me. It's right in the political world that Churchill was in, but it's even more correct in the spiritual world. Never trust someone who is not being opposed. That means almost certainly he's not walking the path of the Lord. I don't think we talk enough about the Holy Spirit, even though, of course, we mention and we honor and we worship the Holy Spirit, that we don't speak sufficiently of this third person of the Trinity. And there might be some truth to that. See, when you get in touch with the Holy Spirit, you're getting in touch with the love that connects the Father and the Son. You're getting in touch with the love that God is, and therefore with the very force that gave rise to the universe. So at the risk of sounding a little bit cosmic and grandiose, you're in touch with the most powerful force imaginable. You want power. I mean the real thing. Surrender your life over to the Holy Spirit. Say, Lord, look, it's not what I want. It's not my projects and plans. It's your projects and plans. You will find you will tap into this source of power to change things for good, change things for the better in your life, in your family, in your place of work. Surrender by a conscious act to the Spirit, and you unleash this great drive.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Quote, Western civilization had an age of reason and an age of enlightenment. In those periods, the quest for reason and enlightenment was a dominant intellectual drive and created a corresponding emotional atmosphere that fostered these values. Today, we live in the age of envy, unquote. And that was the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the 33 strategies of war.
Your strategies will be weak and mechanical, based on things that happened in the past, or to someone else. Like a monkey, you will imitate instead of create. Retreating is something you must do every now and then to find yourself and detach yourself from infecting influences. And the best time to do this is in moments of difficulty and danger. Symbolically, the retreat is religious or mythological. It was only by escaping into the desert that Moses and the Jews were able to solidify their identity and reemerge as a social and political force. Jesus spent his 40 days in the wilderness, and Muhammad too fled Mecca at a time of great peril for a period of retreat. He and just a handful of his most devoted supporters used this period to deepen their bonds, to understand who they were and what they stood for, to let time work its good. Then this little band of believers reemerged to conquer Mecca and the Arabian Peninsula, and later, after Muhammad's death, to defeat the Byzantines and the Persian Empire, spreading Islam over vast territories. Around the world, every mythology has a hero who retreats, even to Hades itself in the case of Odysseus, to find himself. If Moses had stayed and fought in Egypt, the Jews would be a footnote in history. If Muhammad had taken on his enemies in Mecca, he would have been crushed and forgotten. When you fight someone more powerful than you are, you lose more than your possessions and position. You lose your ability to think straight, to keep yourself separate and distinct. You become infected with the emotions and violence of the aggressor in ways you cannot imagine. Better to flee and use the time your flight buys to turn inward. Let the enemy take land and advance. You will recover and turn the tables when the time comes. The decision to retreat shows not weakness but strength. It is the height of strategic wisdom. The essence of retreat is the refusal to engage the enemy in any way, whether psychologically or physically. You may do this defensively to protect yourself, but it can also be a positive strategy. By refusing to fight aggressive enemies, you can effectively infuriate and unbalance them. During World War I, England and Germany fought a side war in East Africa, where each of them had a colony. In 1915, the English commander, Lieutenant General Jan Smuts, moved against the much smaller German army in German East Africa, led by Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. Smuts was hoping for a quick win. As soon as he had finished off the Germans, his troops could move to more important theaters of war. But von Lettow-Vorbeck refused to engage him and retreated south. Smuts marched in pursuit. Time and again, Smuts thought he had von Lettow-Vorbeck cornered, only to find that the German officer had moved on just hours earlier. As if drawn by a magnet, Smuts followed von Lettow-Vorbeck across rivers, mountains, and forests. Their supply lines extended over hundreds of miles. His soldiers were now vulnerable to small, harassing actions from the Germans, which destroyed their morale. Bogged down in pestilential jungles, as time went by, Smuts's army was decimated by hunger and disease, all without ever fighting a real battle. By the end of the war, von Lettow-Vorbeck had managed to lead his enemy on a 4-year cat-and-mouse chase that had completely tied up valuable English forces and yielded them nothing in return. Smuts was a persistent, thorough, aggressive leader who liked to defeat his opponents through maneuver in the field. Von Lettow-Vorbeck played on this taste. He refused to engage Smuts in frontal battle, but stayed enticingly close, just beyond reach, holding out the possibility of engagement so as to keep the Englishmen pushing forward into the wilderness. Infuriated to no end, Smuts continued the chase. Von Lettow-Vorbeck used Africa's vast spaces and inhospitable climate to destroy the English. Most people respond to aggression by, in some way, getting involved with it. It is almost impossible to hold back. By disengaging completely and retreating, you show great power and restraint. Your enemies are desperate for you to react. Retreat infuriates and provokes them into further attack. So keep retreating, exchanging space for time. Stay calm and balanced. Let them take the land they want. Like the Germans, lure them into a void of non-action. They will start to overextend themselves and make mistakes. Time is on your side, for you are not wasting any of it in useless battles. War is notoriously full of surprises, of unforeseen events that can slow down and ruin even the best-laid plan. Karl von Clausewitz called this friction. War is a constant illustration of Murphy's Law. If anything can go wrong, it will. But when you retreat, when you exchange space for time, you are making Murphy's Law work for you. So it was with von Lettow-Vorbeck. He set up Smuts as the victim of Murphy's Law, giving him enough time to make the worst come to pass. During the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63, Frederick the Great of Prussia was faced with Austrian, French, and Russian armies on every side, all determined to carve him up. A strategist who usually favored aggressive attack, Frederick this time went on the defensive, crafting his maneuvers to buy himself time and slip the net his enemies were trying to catch him in. Year after year, he managed to avoid disaster, though barely. Then suddenly, Tsarina Elizabeth of Russia died. She had hated Frederick bitterly, but her nephew and successor to the throne, Tsar Peter III, was a perverse young boy who had not liked his aunt and greatly admired Frederick the Great. He not only pulled Russia out of the war, he allied himself with the Prussians. The 7 Years' War was over. The miracle Frederick needed had come to pass. Had he surrendered at his worst point, or tried to fight his way out, he would have lost everything. Instead, he maneuvered to create time for Murphy's Law to do its work on his enemies. War is a physical affair, which takes place somewhere specific. Generals depend on maps and plan strategies to be realized in particular locations. But time is just as important as space in strategic thought, and knowing how to use time will make you a superior strategist, giving an added dimension to your attacks and defense. To do this, you must stop thinking of time as an abstraction. In reality, beginning the minute you are born, time is all you have. It is your only true commodity. People can take away your possessions, but short of murder, not even the most powerful aggressors can take time away from you unless you let them. Even in prison, your time is your own if you use it for your own purposes. To waste your time in battles not of your choosing is more than just a mistake. It is stupidity of the highest order. Time lost can never be regained. Reversal. When enemies attack you in overwhelming force, instead of retreating, you may sometimes decide to engage them directly. You are inviting martyrdom, perhaps even hoping for it. But martyrdom, too, is a strategy, and one of ancient standing. Martyrdom makes you a symbol, a rallying point for the future. The strategy will succeed if you are important enough, if your defeat has symbolic meaning, but the circumstances must work to highlight the rightness of your cause and the ugliness of the enemy's. Your sacrifice must also be unique. Too many martyrs spread over too much time will spoil the effect. In cases of extreme weakness, when facing an impossibly large enemy, martyrdom can be used to show that your side's fighting spirit has not been extinguished, a useful way to keep up morale. But in general, martyrdom is a dangerous weapon and can backfire, for you may no longer be there to see it through, and its effects are too strong to be controlled. It can also take centuries to work. Even when it may prove symbolically successful, a good strategist avoids it. Retreat is always the better strategy. Retreat must never be an end in itself. At some point, you have to turn around and fight. If you don't, retreat is more accurately called surrender. The enemy wins. Combat is, in the long run, unavoidable. Retreat can only be temporary. Here are further reflections on the strategy of non-engagement. From the I Ching. 6 in the 4th place means the army retreats, no blame. In face of a superior enemy, with whom it would be hopeless to engage in battle, an orderly retreat is the only correct procedure, because it will save the army from defeat and disintegration. It is by no means a sign of courage or strength to insist upon engaging in a hopeless struggle regardless of circumstances. From the Huainanzi, China, 2nd century BC. Opportunities are changing ceaselessly. Those who get there too early have gone too far, while those who get there too late cannot catch up. As the sun and moon go through their courses, time does not go along with people. Therefore, sages do not value huge jewels as much as they value a little time. Time is hard to find and easy to lose.
And that was the end of Chapter 11, Trade Space for Time, from the 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, former President Ronald Reagan presenting the Medal of Honor to Roy Benavidez.
Forces, ladies and gentlemen, several years ago, we brought home a group of American fighting men who had obeyed their country's call and who had fought as bravely and as well as any Americans in our history. They came home without a victory, not because they'd been defeated, but because they'd been denied permission to win. They were greeted by no parades. They were greeted by no parades, no bands, no waving of the flag they had so nobly served. There's been no thank you for their sacrifice. There's been no effort to honor and thus give pride to the families of more than 57,000 young men who gave their lives in that faraway war. As the poet Lawrence Binyon wrote, "They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them." Pride, of course, cannot wipe out the burden of grief borne by their families, but it can make that grief easier to bear. The pain will not be quite as sharp if they know their fellow citizens share that pain. There's been little or no recognition of the gratitude we owe to the more than 300,000 men who suffered wounds in that war. John Stuart Mill said, "War is an ugly thing, but not the ugliest of things. A man who has nothing which he cares about more than his personal safety is a miserable creature and has no chance of being free unless made and kept so by the exertions of better men than himself." It's time to show our pride in them and to thank them. In his book, The Bridges at Toko-Ri, novelist James Michener writes movingly of the heroes who fought in the Korean conflict. In the book's final scene, an admiral stands on the darkened bridge of his carrier waiting for pilots he knows will never return from their mission. And as he waits, he asks in the silent darkness, "Where did we get such men?" Almost a generation later, I asked that same question when our POWs were returned from savage captivity in Vietnam. Where did we find such men? We find them where we've always found them. In our villages and towns, on our city streets, in our shops and on our farms. I have one more Vietnam story, and the individual in this story was brought up on a farm outside of Cureo in DeWitt County, Texas, and he is here today. Thanks to the Secretary of Defense, Cap Weinberger, I learned of his story, which had been overlooked or buried for several years. It has to do with the highest award our nation can give, the Congressional Medal of Honor, given only for service above and beyond the call of duty. Secretary Weinberger, would you please escort Sergeant Benavidez forward? Ladies and gentlemen, we're honored to have with us today Master Sergeant Roy P. Benavides, U.S. Army, retired. Let me read the plain, factual military language of the citation that was lost for too long a time. Master Sergeant Roy P. Benavides, United States Army, retired for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Where there is a brave man, it is said, there is the thickest of the fight. There is the place of honor. On May 2nd, 1968, Master Sergeant, then Staff Sergeant Roy P. Benavides, distinguished himself by a series of daring and extremely valorous actions while assigned to Detachment B-56, 5th Special Forces Group Airborne, 1st Special Forces, Republic of Vietnam. On the morning of May 2nd, 1968, a 12-man Special Forces reconnaissance team was inserted by helicopters in a dense jungle area west of Loc Ninh, Vietnam, to gather intelligence information about confirmed large-scale enemy activity. This area was controlled and routinely patrolled by the North Vietnamese Army. After a short period of time on the ground, the team met heavy enemy resistance and requested emergency extraction. 3 helicopters attempted extraction, but were unable to land due to intense enemy small arms and anti-aircraft fire. Sergeant Benavides was at the forward operating base in Loc Ninh monitoring the operation by radio when these helicopters returned to offload wounded crew members and to assess aircraft damage. Sergeant Benavides voluntarily boarded a returning aircraft to assist in another extraction attempt. Realizing that all the team members were either dead or wounded and unable to move to the pickup zone, he directed the aircraft to a nearby clearing where he jumped from the hovering helicopter and ran approximately 75 meters under withering small arms fire to the crippled team. Prior to reaching the team's position, he was wounded in his right leg, face, and head. Despite these painful injuries, he took charge, repositioning the team members and directing their fire to facilitate the landing of an extraction aircraft and the loading of wounded and dead team members. He then threw smoke canisters to direct the aircraft to the team's position. Despite his severe wounds and under intense enemy fire, he carried and dragged half of the wounded team members to the awaiting aircraft. He then provided protective fire by running alongside the aircraft as it moved to pick up the remaining team members. As the enemy's fire intensified, he hurried to recover the body and the classified documents on the dead team leader. When he reached the team leader's body, Sergeant Benavides was severely wounded by small arms fire in the abdomen and grenade fragments in his back. At nearly the same moment, the aircraft pilot was mortally wounded and his helicopter crashed. Although in extremely critical condition due to his multiple wounds, Sergeant Benavides secured the classified documents and made his way back to the wreckage, where he aided the wounded out of the overturned aircraft and gathered the stunned survivors into a defensive perimeter. Under increasing enemy automatic weapons and grenade fire, he moved around the perimeter, distributing water and ammunition to his weary men, reinstilling in them a will to live and fight. Facing a buildup of enemy opposition with a beleaguered team, Sergeant Benavides mustered his strength and began calling in tactical airstrikes and directing the fire from supporting gunships to suppress the enemy's fire and so permit another extraction attempt. He was wounded again in his thigh by small arms fire while administering first aid to a wounded team member just before another extraction helicopter was able to land. His indomitable spirit kept him going as he began to carry his comrades to the craft. On his second trip with the wounded, he was clubbed from behind by an enemy soldier. In the ensuing hand-to-hand combat, he sustained additional wounds to his head and arms before killing his adversary. He then continued under devastating fire to carry the wounded to the helicopter. Upon reaching the aircraft, he spotted and killed 2 enemy soldiers who were rushing the craft from an angle that prevented the aircraft door gunner from firing upon them. With little strength remaining, he made one last trip to the perimeter to ensure that all classified material had been collected or destroyed and to bring in the remaining wounded. Only then, in serious condition from numerous wounds and loss of blood, did he allow himself to be pulled into the extraction aircraft. Sergeant Benavides' gallant choice to join voluntarily his comrades who were in critical straits, to expose himself constantly to withering enemy fire, and his refusal to be stopped despite numerous severe wounds saved the lives of at least 8 men. His fearless personal leadership, tenacious devotion to duty, and extremely valorous actions in the face of overwhelming odds were in keeping with the finest traditions of the military service and reflect the utmost credit on him and the United States Army. Sergeant Benedictus, a nation grateful to you and to all your comrades living and dead, awards you its highest symbol of gratitude for service above and beyond the call of duty, the Congressional Medal of Honor.
And that was Ronald Reagan, former President Ronald Reagan, awarding the Medal of Honor to Roy Benavidez. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States. Today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to be honest, smart, and beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.